In this lecture, I'd like to talk about indirect price discrimination. Many of you who've flown before on an airline know that airlines cater to both business travelers and leisure travelers. Now, one of the many differences between these two groups of consumers is that business travelers have less elastic demand than leisure travelers. For one, they don't typically pay for their own tickets. It's paid for out of oftentimes company expenditures. And there's often more time sensitivity. So as a result, business travelers tend to be less price sensitive or have less elastic demand. In addition, leisure travelers are planning their vacation well in advance, and if you're going to Cancun sometime next winter, you've got a lot of flexibility and might shop around for a good price. On the other hand, if you need to be in New York City on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock for a business meeting, it really doesn't matter how much the airplane ticket costs, you've got to go then, and so you're going to be less price sensitive to variations in prices of tickets. Now, airlines know this and decide or very deliberately price tickets in such a way as to capture some of this potential surplus. For instance, as the travel date gets closer and closer, the gap between the time you purchase the ticket and the time you are actually flying, as that time window shrinks, airlines assume more and more, or that it is more and more likely that you're a business traveler and you are fairly price inelastic, that you don't have a lot of price sensitivity. And one phenomenon that consumers see is that the price of the ticket goes up as the departure date gets closer. Now, in this chapter, we're going to look at this practice of charging different prices to different groups of consumers, known as price discrimination. We're going to look at this from the perspective of the firm, and we're going to focus in on indirect price discrimination. Indirect price discrimination is a term that economists use to describe a situation where the firm can't actually determine whether the customer is from a high or a low value group. Now, direct price discrimination also exists in many contexts. When, say, a restaurant offers a senior citizen discount, they ask for an ID. And by that ID, they can tell positively whether a consumer or customer belongs to, say, one group, senior citizens, or the other group, non-senior citizens. But when you go to buy an airplane ticket through Travelocity, say, or a travel agent, the airline doesn't know with certainty whether you're buying that for business or leisure purposes. They might ask you and you might tell them, but the very fact that you're buying that doesn't allow them to infer whether you're a business or leisure traveler. And they can't positively identify whether you're one or the other, because most individuals at some point will buy tickets for a business purpose and at some other point will buy tickets for a leisure purpose. So any one individual at any point in time might be able to wear both of those hats. So indirect price discrimination refers to the situation where the firm cannot identify with certainty whether a particular customer belongs to a high value or a low value group. We're going to talk about the importance of preventing arbitrage between those two groups, and we're going to see how the firm, an airline for example, can price discriminate by pricing products based on price sensitivities or elasticities of demand. And with price discrimination, indirect price discrimination, what's actually kind of interesting is it's often the case that the firm will actually design different products that are designed to appeal to different groups of customers, and the customers identify themselves because they voluntarily self-select by purchasing the particular product that was designed to appeal to their customer group. A second type of indirect price discrimination that we'll talk about is metering. Metering identifies high-value customers based on how intensively they use the product. For instance, how often or how intensively I use printer cartridges may be correlated with the value I place on being able to print. In this case, firms will charge a large markup on the item that customers use, the consumable aspect, and will place a low markup or even give away for free the item that is only purchased one time. So we'll talk about metering as well as another example of indirect price discrimination. We'll also talk about bundling. Bundling is an idea that simply refers to combining or bundling either multiple groups of a product and selling in volume, or bundling different groups of or different products together. The basic idea in all of these indirect price discrimination strategies is to offer a low-value product or a low-value bundle to the low-value customers, those customers who are very price-sensitive and have high elasticities, and then to offer a different bundle designed to appeal to the high-value customers, being defined as those who are not very price-sensitive. In other words, have low elasticities. The key here is that, or one key idea is that indirect price discrimination is not only a pricing decision, it's a product design issue as well. And it's very important to design the products in such a way, and especially in such a way, that the low-end product does not appeal to the high-end customer. Otherwise, you may have cannibalization of sales where the high-value customers actually go for the bargain product. And that destroys the price discrimination strategy and undermines the profitability. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples. And I'd like to start with the example of Hewlett-Packard, who is, among other things, known for the manufacture of printers. Now, HP identifies high and low value customers in the printer market based on how much ink they use. There is a correlation, a positive correlation, between how much value one customer or firm places on being able to print and how much ink they actually use. The more they print, the more they tend to value printing. So what HP does is they charge a very high markup, 50% over marginal cost, on their ink cartridges, while only placing a 15% or only earning a 15% markup on the printer. And that sort of makes sense. If you have two customers, one who prints a lot and one who prints a little, they both need one printer. But the one who prints a lot needs many more ink cartridges. And so the metering strategy that's being described here is one that meters out or captures profit every time that consumable, renewable item, in this case printer cartridges, is consumed. So in 2003, for example, HP made $10 billion on their printers and $12 billion on ink cartridge sales. Now, this is revenue, actually, so that they brought in. So you can see that it was about equal, but their profit on ink cartridges was 3 times the level of the profit on the printers. So the printers there were the low margin product, and the high margin product is the reusable part, or not the reusable part, the part that's used over and over again or purchased over and over again, the ink cartridges. We often see this with razors and razor blades. If you buy a Gillette Mach 3 razor, say, you'll buy one handle and then you'll buy multiple cartridges. The handle is practically given away for free, but the cartridges, which you use over and over, and the more highly you value a good close shave, the more frequently you're going to buy new cartridges. Those cartridges are the high profit margin item. Movies and popcorn is another example. You pay once to get into the movie, but then to the extent that you enjoy or very much value highly the experience of seeing the movie and having some concessions, you'll buy more popcorn. And so the popcorn is sold at a very high margin, the movie ticket at a relatively low margin. Now, this type of strategy works because high-value customers use more cartridges than low-value customers. So let's look at this example. Let's suppose, based upon this table, give you a little bit of background, we've got a high-value customer and a low-value customer. And we are going to assume that the high-value customer places an economic value on being able to print the amount that they need to. The value that they place on that is $100. The high-value customer has a value or places a value of $200 on being able to print what they need. And we're told here that the low-value customer needs to use the equivalent of one cartridge, ink cartridge, in order to be able to print what they need. The high-value customer prints twice as much and therefore needs to be able to print 2 cartridges or use 2 cartridges. Now, let's consider 2 pricing strategies. Strategy 1 would be to charge $50 for the printer and $50 for the cartridge. Strategy 2 would be to give the printer away, charge $0, and to charge $100 for the cartridge. Now, We're starting our analysis of the pricing strategy here looking at the low value customer, and very frequently when dealing with price discrimination, especially indirect price discrimination, we start out with the low value customer and establish the pricing strategy for that customer before moving on to the high value customer. And we'll see in a couple more examples here in a few minutes why that makes sense to start that way. So these two strategies have been formulated based upon or targeting the $100 value that the low value customer places on being able to print. You can see that in either case, whether HP or the printer company pursues strategy 1 or strategy 2, each of those will result in $100 of outlay for the low value customer because they need one printer and one cartridge. So in some sense, the low value customer would be indifferent between these two strategies. But let's look at what those strategies imply for the high value customer. The high value customer who's willing to pay up to $200 in order to print what they need needs to be able to obtain 2 cartridges. Under strategy 1, they would buy 1 printer and 2 cartridges. That would result in $150 of additional revenue for the firm. Under strategy 2, they would receive for free the printer and buy the 2 cartridges at $100 each. That would result in $200 of additional revenue. From the perspective of the printer company, the printer manufacturer, strategy 2 is the dominant strategy. Strategy 2, in fact, is the only strategy that captures all of the surplus from both the low and the high value customer. And what we see then is that strategy 2 corresponds to the metering strategy or metering scheme described just a moment ago, where one product is sold at a very low margin. In this case, giving the printer away would probably actually be a negative margin decision, and the other product is sold at a very high margin. This results in total revenue of $300 under strategy 2 versus $250 under strategy 1. In either case, the costs to the firm are the same. Both cases, the firm is producing 2 printers and a total of 3 printer cartridges, and so we can see that strategy 2 would be the more profitable strategy from the perspective of the firm. Now, indirect price discrimination relies on the prevention of arbitrage, and by arbitrage here, what we're simply referring to in this context is a situation where the high-value customer actually either defects and goes and buys the low-value product. That's sometimes also referred to as cannibalization. Or a situation where the low-value customers will actually buy the product at a low price and turn around and sell it to the high-value customers at some price that's in between the price they paid and the price that's being charged to the high-value customers. If that type of arbitrage occurs, it can completely undermine the price discrimination strategy. So, in that case, or in response to that, it's very often the case that firms will actually design different products to appeal to different classes of consumers. And if that's the case, or if they successfully do that, the high-value customers really don't even want anything to do with the low-end or low-value product. Let's talk about a couple of examples of indirect price discrimination. Grocery store coupons would be an example of indirect price discrimination. Grocery store coupons allow customers who are more price sensitive, oftentimes that's correlated with a lower income, but not always. More price sensitive customers can use coupons and receive discounts or lower prices. High-value customers can reveal their type simply by showing up at the checkout lane without coupons, and they are less price sensitive, less likely to clip coupons, and therefore will pay the higher price. This pricing scheme can be dangerous, though, because it has several risks. For instance, you might end up with too many high-value customers actually deciding to clip coupons. In that case, everybody would be buying at the low price, and the strategy might become unprofitable. A second risk is it creates a profit opportunity for rivals or new entrants. For example, with Hewlett-Packard, unless HP can prevent rivals from selling essentially equivalent ink cartridges for a lower price or selling refills, HP is going to lose sales. In some cases, businesses can increase their profit by tying the sales of one product to the purchases of another. So new ink cartridges to the sale of printers, but in many instances this may violate antitrust laws. In the words of one former antitrust regulator, do not tie the sale of one product to another. Such arrangements are only legal in a few rare instances to ensure effective functioning of complicated equipment such as an MRI machine or a nuclear power generator, but they are generally against the law. Let's look at a second example. Minitab is a common statistical software commonly found in many academic computer labs. In 2009, Minitab sold an academic version which was aimed at students for $50, while selling the full-featured model aimed at businesses for $1,195. Now, here the threat of cannibalization is very clear. And in order to avoid losing money, the manufacturer here has to price or design the two versions so that the high-end version or the high-value customers really do prefer the full-featured version. So one of the ways that they did that, Minitab did that or achieved that, was they eliminated certain key statistical tests from the academic version, and they put limits on how many observations could be actually analyzed at any given time under the academic or student version. Those two limitations made it essentially obsolete for commercial users who then opted in to or preferred paying the full price for the full functionality. Another example is Adobe Photoshop. I'd like to talk through this example in some detail. Let's consider the pricing and design of Adobe Photoshop software. Adobe Photoshop software is really designed to appeal to two different groups of consumers: home users and commercial or high-end users. And the table here gives us some values that each of these consumer groups will place on both a full-featured or fully functional version of the Adobe Photoshop software and a disabled or reduced form version. You could imagine that these values come from the result of some focus groups or survey groups for each of these customers, and these values represent the most that these customers would be willing to pay for either the full or disabled version. So let's look first at the home user. The home user, we can see, would be willing to pay up to $175 for the full version and $150 for the home version. One of the key features that's eliminated or stripped out of the full version when going from full to disabled is CMYK, a full color spectrum palette. Now, most home users don't even know what those letters stand for, let alone need the functionality associated with them. Of course, they recognize that there's probably some value in having that, and so all things equal, they would like the full version more than the disabled version, but we can see from the 175 and 150 that the relative value that they place on that extra feature is relatively small. In fact, we could also say that they are willing to pay only $25 to upgrade from the low version to the high or full-featured version. That's an important way to look at this. How much are they willing to pay for an upcharge in order to go from the low to the high-end product? If we look over at the commercial users, we notice something different. First of all, the commercial users value Adobe Photoshop more than the home users, no matter what version it is. 200 is more than 150, and 500 is more than 175. The second thing we notice is that the gap between the 500 and 200, or the $300, is much more sizable. This tells us that the commercial users would be willing to pay up to $300 more in order to obtain that additional feature. That tells us a couple of things. It tells us, yes, they value that pretty highly, but it also tells us that it's not indispensable. Right? They still would be willing to pay up to $200 for the disabled version. If they didn't want anything to do with the disabled version, that number in the lower right corner would be 0. So we see that they value both versions, and they're willing to pay up to $300 in order to upgrade from the disabled to the full-featured version. Now, let's think about some pricing strategies that Adobe might consider when targeting these different customer groups with potentially two different products. Let's start with something very simple. Let's suppose that instead of trying to be all things to all people, or they're willing only to be some things to some people. In other words, let's assume strategy one is that Adobe decides, look, we're only going to sell the high-end version to the high-end customers. Forget the low-end customers, we're not even going to go in the household market. Forget the disabled version, we're not even going to create that version. What would they do? Well, let's assume a couple more things. We need to assume something about the distribution of customers between commercial and household users, and let's assume that that market is split 50-50. An easy way to model a 50-50 split in a customer base would be to assume two customers, one of each type. Now, we can very much generalize this, or very easily generalize this. If we had, say, a 90% 10% split, a very easy way to model that would be to assume 10 customers, 9 of one type and 1 of the other type. So let's assume a 50-50 split. So there are two customers, one of each type. If Adobe sells only the high-end product and sells it at $500, they will sell one copy. And if we assume that the marginal cost is essentially zero for this particular product, as it is for most software, their total profits would be $500. Now, an alternative strategy would be to sell the high-end version, but try to sell it both to the commercial and the home users. Here, the price ceiling is dictated by the maximum price the home users are willing to pay, which is $175. The only way they can sell to both groups is to price the high-end product at $175. In that instance, they'll sell 2 copies of the software, and total profit will be 2 times $175, or $300. Immediately, we can see that this strategy, too, is not nearly as good as even the strategy 1 that we just considered. So strategy 2 is definitely suboptimal and can immediately be eliminated from consideration. But now let's consider a price discrimination strategy. Suppose that they decide to price to target the high-end customers with the high functionality product and the low value or low-end customers with the low functionality product. What would be the optimal prices? Here it's a little tricky, but again, let's start with the low value customer and ask, what is the maximum price the low value or home user customer will pay for the disabled software? And the answer was $150. Now, using that as our starting point, we can then determine the maximum price that Adobe can charge on the high-end product. Well, we know that the high-end users are willing to pay $300 to upgrade from the low to the high product. That would take us from $150 to $450. So $450 is the most that the high-end user, the commercial user, will pay for the full-featured version when the low-featured version or the disabled version is being offered at $150. Yes, the high-end users have said or revealed they would pay up to $500. But if they buy a product at $500 that they value at $500, they're obtaining no surplus. If they buy a product at $450 that they value at $500, they're obtaining $50 of surplus. Where does the $50 of surplus come from? That is an important reference point. And the reason it's important is that when the low-end product is being offered at $150, the high-end users always have the option of buying that product, which they value at $200. So if they bought into the low-featured or the disabled software for $150, that would be generating $50 of economic surplus for the commercial user. The only way that the firm, Adobe, can induce them to buy the high-valued product is if they offer that at a price that generates at least $50 of additional surplus for the high-end commercial user. So there are a couple ways to look at how we get to that $450 maximum price point for the full-featured software. One way of getting that is starting at the $150 and observing that the high-end commercial users will be only willing to pay $300 to upgrade. That takes us from $150 to $450. A second angle also gets us the right economic intuition is to observe that they can already obtain $50 of surplus by buying for $150 the low-end version they value at $200. The only way we'll get them to buy the high-end version is if we offer them at least that much surplus, which means selling it at $450 or below. And here in this example we see that Adobe gave that price a $1 haircut to $449. At that price, the high-end user is obtaining or receiving $51 of economic surplus by purchasing at $449, a product that they value at $500. This price discrimination strategy generates $599 of profit, $150 from the low-end sale, $449 from the high-end sale. and this is the dominant pricing strategy that leads to the optimal or maximum profits when we have two customers, one of each type, who want to buy at most one subscription or one unit of the software. A couple other examples. In 1990, IBM released the Laser Printer E, which was a lower priced alternative to its popular laser printer. Now, the Laser Printer E printed at a speed of 5 pages per minute compared to 10 pages per minute for the higher version or the high-end version. It was kind of interesting. IBM actually had to add an additional chip to the Laser Printer E to slow down the printing speed. It actually increased the marginal cost. So the low-end product actually cost more to produce than the high-end product. And this pricing strategy is known as a damaged goods pricing strategy. Frequently successful price discrimination attracts competition. Between 1997 and 2005, competition drove United Airlines to reduce prices on its business class tickets from Philadelphia to Chicago. For instance, in 1997, the highest price that United charged was 3 times higher than the lowest price ticket. By 2005, the spread had dramatically shrunk. The highest priced ticket was less than 2 times the lowest priced ticket. In this example, look, this is a time series of a number of different ticket prices. We can see that entry into the market by Midway Airlines and then by Southwest Airlines, so higher competition, actually reduced the spread of fares that United Airlines was able to charge on that particular route. Volume discounts or volume purchases can be used to discriminate between buyers. For instance, let's suppose a single customer is willing to pay $7 for the first unit of a good purchased, $6 for the second, $5 for the third, and so on. Now, a price of $7 would mean that the customer would buy only 1 unit. But a price of $6 means that the customer would buy 2 units. The price represents the value that the consumer places on each unit consumed, known as an individual demand curve. If the seller sets a single price for this product, they're going to price it at such a point where the marginal revenue exceeds the marginal cost. If we assume the marginal cost is $1.50, this would imply setting a price of $5. You can confirm that at $5, that's the last price point at which marginal revenue exceeds a marginal cost of $1.50. But if we think about this, marginal cost is just $1.50. So this leaves unconsummated several wealth-creating transactions. The consumer would be willing to buy a 4th unit at $4, a 5th unit at $5 or $3, and a 6th unit at $2. All of those prices, 4, 3, and 2, are more than the marginal cost of production, and yet they remain unconsummated. The seller leaves money on the table. To increase profitability, the seller has to find a way to sell more units or additional units at lower prices without lowering the price on the first 3 units sold. This can be done a number of ways. One way would be to offer volume discounts. Another way would be to offer 2-part pricing, a fixed price plus a unit price. If we think about how this would work, let's observe that for all 6 units, the customer would be willing to pay $27. Those 6 units cost only $9 to produce, and so there's a total potential surplus here of $18. Now, one way of bundling these would be to sell a standalone product at $7, a 2-unit package for 7 plus 6 or $13, a 3-pack for 7 plus 6 plus 5, which is $18, a 4-pack for $22, and so on, all the way up to a 6-pack for $27. Now, in those instances, the seller would be capturing all of the surplus. More likely will be the case that the seller will identify that there's a total of $18 of surplus on the table, and then will institute some kind of volume bundle pricing where that surplus is split or bargained over between the customer and the supplier. Not bargained over in the literal sense that they actually haggle over it in the store, but bargained over in the sense that the customer has a certain degree of pricing power, and that depends on whether substitute products exist. the firm has a certain degree of pricing power, again, based upon the intensity of competition. And that intensity of the competition will determine the outcome of the bargain. In other words, determine how far or how close to the $27, say a six-pack bundle, would be priced. Somewhere between 9 and 27 would be the range or the admissible range of potential profitable bundle prices, and intensity of competition and consumer choices will somewhat dictate where that occurs. So bundling the goods together, again, just to reiterate, the customer's total value is $27. With enough bargaining power, the consumer could capture all of that surplus, and if with no bargaining power, the consumer would pay $27. So when selling bundles of goods, a key economic idea is that when bargaining with a customer, don't bargain over the unit price, instead bargain over the bundled price. Sellers can bundle like items, or when customer value decreases with each additional unit, or they can bundle different items with different consumer demands. Thanks for listening.